May's Diner had stood at the crossroads of Highway 58 and Desert Road for 43 years, serving truckers, travelers, and locals with the same simple promise: good food, strong coffee, and a place where everybody was welcome. The building wasn't much to look at. Faded blue paint, a neon sign that flickered on humid nights, and a parking lot more gravel than asphalt. But it was the heart of Barstow, California, and everyone who lived there knew it. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Sarah Chen had owned the diner since her husband passed 4 years ago, running it with the help of her son Lucas and a rotating cast of waitresses. At 48, Sarah was fighting a battle she hadn't told many people about: stage 2 breast cancer that was draining her savings as fast as it was draining her strength. The chemotherapy left her exhausted, but she refused to close the diner. It was all she had. Lucas Chen was 9 years old, small for his age, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined chin. He had started helping at the diner 6 months ago, when his mother's illness made it impossible for her to work full shifts. He cleared tables, refilled water glasses, brought out simple orders, and did it all with a quiet efficiency that made the regular customers smile. His father, James Chen, had been a Marine. 2 tours in Afghanistan, medals for bravery, and a reputation for being the kind of man who would walk through fire for his brothers. He had also been a member of the Hells Angels, not a contradiction but a continuation of loyalty. When he died in a training accident 4 years ago, the Angels had shown up to his funeral 300 strong, and they made a promise to Sarah. James's family would always be protected. Today was a Tuesday, slow and hot, the kind of afternoon that made the air shimmer above the asphalt. Lucas was wiping down table 6 when the Bentley pulled into the parking lot. He watched through the window as a man in an expensive suit stepped out, looked around with obvious disgust, and walked toward the entrance. Richard Thornton was 62 years old and worth approximately $4 billion. He had inherited most of it from his father and maintained it through ruthless business practices. He was traveling from Los Angeles to Las Vegas for a meeting, and his driver had insisted they stop. The diner was the only option for miles. Thornton pushed through the door and immediately wrinkled his nose at the smell of grease and coffee. His eyes swept the room with contempt: the worn booths, the faded photographs on the walls, the simple people eating simple food. He spotted an empty table in the corner and walked toward it, not waiting to be seated. Lucas approached with a glass of water and a menu, just as his mother had taught him. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to May's Diner. Can I start you with something to drink?" Thornton didn't look at him. "Coffee, black, and make sure it's fresh. I won't drink anything that's been sitting on a burner." "Yes, sir, I'll bring a fresh pot right away." Lucas hurried to the kitchen, where his mother was resting on a stool, her face pale from her morning treatment. "Mama, the man at table 8 wants fresh coffee. Should I make a new pot?" Sarah glanced through the serving window at the man in the expensive suit. Something about him made her uneasy, but she nodded. "Go ahead, mijo. And be extra careful with him. Some people are harder to please than others." Lucas made the coffee with care, watching the pot fill with dark liquid, making sure it was perfect. He carried it to table 8 on a small tray, concentrating hard on not spilling a single drop. But as he reached the table, his foot caught on the uneven floor, a spot that had needed fixing for months, and he stumbled. The coffee pot tilted. A small splash of hot liquid hit the edge of the table, and a few drops landed on the white tablecloth, near Thornton's sleeve. Not on him, just near him. But it was enough. Thornton exploded. "You stupid, clumsy idiot!" He shot to his feet, his face contorting with rage. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? More than this entire pathetic establishment." Lucas froze, his eyes wide with shock and fear. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm so sorry. It didn't touch you. I can clean it up." But Thornton wasn't listening. His anger had found a target, and he wasn't about to let go. He leaned down until his face was inches from Lucas's, close enough for the boy to smell his expensive cologne and see the cold fury in his eyes. And then he started speaking in Japanese. The words that came out of Richard Thornton's mouth were not meant to be understood by anyone in the diner. He had learned Japanese during his years doing business in Tokyo, and he used it now as a weapon, a way to unleash his full contempt without consequences, or so he thought. "Kono kusogaki," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "Omae no yuna mazushi gomi wa, ore no kutsu wo migaku kachi mo nai. Omae no haha wa fukeisha da. Kono mise wa gomi dameda." "You worthless brat. Poor garbage like you isn't even worth polishing my shoes. Your mother is a disgrace. This place is a trash heap. Lucas didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Tears welled in his eyes as the man continued his tirade, jabbing a finger toward him, his voice rising with each insult. The other customers had fallen silent, watching the scene with a mixture of horror and helplessness. Sarah burst through the kitchen door, moving faster than her weakened body should have allowed. "Sir, please. He's just a child. Whatever happened, I'm sure we can—" "Stay out of this," Thornton snapped in English. "This is between me and this incompetent little—" He switched back to Japanese, unleashing another stream of insults that made even his driver, waiting by the door, wince. What none of them knew was that Big Earl Thompson was sitting 3 booths away. Earl was 64 years old, a retired trucker who had driven rigs across America for 40 years. He was also a Vietnam veteran, a former POW who had spent 18 months in a camp where he had learned to speak Japanese from a fellow prisoner, a skill he had never forgotten. He understood every word coming out of Thornton's mouth, and he knew exactly who Lucas Chen's father had been. Earl said nothing. He simply pulled out his phone, scrolled to a contact labeled Hammer, and sent a text message. "May's Diner. James Chen's boy is being attacked. Rich man in a suit. Insulting him in Japanese. You need to hear what he's saying about the kid. Get here now. Bring everyone." The response came in seconds. "On our way. Nobody touches that boy." Earl put his phone away and continued to watch, his weathered face betraying nothing. But inside, a cold anger was building, the same anger that had kept him alive in that prison camp, the same anger that had made him dangerous to anyone who threatened the innocent. Thornton finally ran out of steam. He threw a $100 bill on the table, far more than anything he had ordered, and sneered at Sarah. "Consider that compensation for having to look at this pathetic excuse for a business, and teach your son some manners before he embarrasses you in front of someone who matters." He turned and strode toward the door, his driver scrambling to open it for him. The Bentley's engine purred to life, and within seconds they were gone, leaving behind a crying child, a devastated mother, and a room full of people who didn't know what to say. Earl rose from his booth and walked over to Lucas, who was still standing, frozen in place, tears streaming down his cheeks. The old trucker knelt down, his knees protesting, and put a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You listen to me, son," Earl said quietly. "What that man said, none of it was true, not a single word. You're a good boy and your daddy would be proud of you, you hear me?" Lucas looked up at him, his voice trembling. "You understood what he said." "I did, and I want you to know something." Earl's eyes were fierce. "There are people in this world who think money makes them powerful. But real power, the kind that matters, comes from having people who love you, and you've got more of that than he'll ever have." Sarah had gathered Lucas in her arms, holding him tight, her own tears falling into his dark hair. She looked at Earl with gratitude and confusion. "What did he say? What did that man say to my son?" Earl hesitated. "Nothing worth repeating, ma'am. Just the words of a small man who needed to feel big." He paused. "But I promise you this, he's going to regret every single one of them." Outside, the sound of distant thunder began to grow, but the sky was clear. The first motorcycle appeared on the horizon 23 minutes after Earl's text message, then another, then 10 more. Within an hour, the parking lot of May's Diner had transformed into a sea of chrome and leather, and the thunder of 300 Harley-Davidsons shook the windows of every building on Desert Road. Marcus Hammer Williams, president of the Barstow chapter of the Hells Angels, dismounted his bike and walked straight into the diner. He was 58 years old, built like a tank, with a grey beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. He had ridden with James Chen for 15 years. He had held Sarah's hand at James's funeral. He had sworn an oath to protect this family. "Sarah," his voice was gentle despite his fearsome appearance. "Earl told us what happened. Where's Lucas?" Sarah emerged from the kitchen, Lucas still clinging to her side. The boy's eyes went wide as he saw the massive biker, but there was no fear in his expression, only recognition. Uncle Hammer, his father had called this man. Uncle Hammer, who had taught Lucas to ride a bicycle, who had shown up every Christmas with presents, who had never forgotten a birthday. Hammer knelt down to Lucas's level, just as Earl had done. "Hey, little man, I heard you had a rough day." Lucas nodded, fresh tears threatening to spill. "A man yelled at me, Uncle Hammer. He said mean things in a different language. I didn't understand, but they sounded really bad." Hammer's jaw tightened, but his voice remained soft. "Earl told me what he said, and I want you to know something. That man was wrong. Everything he said was a lie. You're a brave kid, Lucas. You're helping your mama when she needs it most. Your daddy would be so proud of you." "Really?" Really? And you know what else? That man is going to apologize to you in person, in front of everyone. Lucas looked confused. But he left, he drove away. Hammer smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only cold determination. He didn't get very far. See, there's only one road out of Barstow heading toward Vegas, and right now, 300 of your daddy's brothers are blocking it. That fancy car isn't going anywhere until we say so. Outside, the scene was extraordinary. The motorcycles had formed a wall across Highway 58, stretching from one side of the road to the other. Local police had arrived, taken one look at the situation, and decided to direct traffic rather than intervene. Sheriff Tom Bradley had known James Chen too. He understood exactly what was happening and why. Thornton's Bentley sat idling in front of the blockade, the driver looking terrified, the billionaire himself red-faced with fury. He had already called the police, his lawyers, and threatened to have every single biker arrested. None of it had made any difference. Hammer walked out of the diner and approached the Bentley, flanked by 20 of his brothers. He knocked on the tinted window with one massive knuckle. The window rolled down an inch. "This is illegal," Thornton hissed. "I'm calling the governor. I'm calling the FBI. You people will spend the rest of your lives in prison." "You can call whoever you want," Hammer replied calmly. "But here's how this is going to work. You're going to get out of this car. You're going to walk back to that diner. And you're going to apologize to that little boy, in English, so everyone can hear. You're going to tell him you were wrong, that you're sorry, and that he's a good kid. And then, only then, will we let you through." "I will do no such thing. Do you have any idea who I am?" Hammer leaned closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "I know exactly who you are. You're a man who insulted a 9-year-old boy in a language you thought no one would understand. You called him garbage. You called his mother a disgrace. You said things that would make most men want to tear you apart." He paused. "I also know who that boy's father was. James Chen was my brother, and we protect our own." The color drained from Thornton's face. "This is extortion." "No, this is consequences. Something you've probably never had to deal with in your life." Hammer straightened up. "You've got 1 hour. After that, we start making phone calls of our own. I wonder what the media would think about a billionaire screaming at a child who's helping his sick mother pay for her cancer treatment. I wonder what your business partners in Tokyo would think about the things you said in Japanese." He turned and walked back toward the diner, leaving Thornton alone with his driver and his choices. The hour was almost up, and 300 motorcycles weren't going anywhere. 53 minutes had passed since Hammer delivered his ultimatum. Inside the Bentley, Richard Thornton sat in silence, his mind racing through options that didn't exist. His lawyers were 3 hours away. The local police had made it clear they weren't going to intervene. His calls to the governor's office had gone unanswered, and the wall of motorcycles blocking the highway showed no signs of moving. His driver, a man named Peterson who had worked for the Thornton family for 20 years, finally spoke. "Sir, if I may, perhaps it would be easier to simply apologize. We could be in Las Vegas within 2 hours and put this whole unpleasant business behind us." "Apologize?" Thornton's voice cracked with disbelief. "To a child, in front of these criminals? Do you have any idea what that would do to my reputation?" Peterson chose his next words carefully. "With respect, sir, your reputation might suffer more if this situation escalates." The man mentioned media coverage. "If this story gets out, a billionaire insulting a 9-year-old boy whose mother has cancer, the damage could be significant." Thornton fell silent. He hadn't considered that angle. His entire life, he had operated with the assumption that money could fix any problem, that wealth was an impenetrable shield against consequences. But these bikers didn't want his money. They wanted something he had never given anyone in his 62 years, a genuine apology. Outside the diner, the scene had taken on an almost festive atmosphere. Word had spread through Barstow and the surrounding towns, and locals had begun arriving to witness the standoff. Someone had set up a grill in the parking lot and was handing out hot dogs to the bikers. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, pointing at the gleaming motorcycles with wonder. A news van from a local station had arrived and was filming the unprecedented blockade. Inside May's diner, Lucas sat in a booth with his mother, surrounded by a protective circle of leather-clad men who treated him like royalty. Big Earl had told them everything, every word the billionaire had spoken in Japanese, every insult, every piece of venom he had directed at an innocent child. The anger in the room was palpable, but it was controlled, channeled into a single purpose. Hammer sat across from Lucas, telling him stories about his father. "Did you know your dad once rode through a thunderstorm for 6 hours straight just to get home for your birthday?" Rain coming down so hard you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you, lightning striking all around, and James just kept going. Nothing was going to stop him from seeing his boy turn 5. Lucas's eyes widened. He never told me that. That was your daddy. He didn't talk about the things he did, and he just did them. Quietly, without asking for anything in return. Hammer's voice softened. You're just like him, you know. Working here every day, helping your mama, never complaining. That takes real courage, Lucas. The kind of courage that man out there will never understand. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Hammer's hand. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for remembering him, for being here. We made a promise, Sarah. The day we buried James, we swore his family would never stand alone. That wasn't just words. Hammer looked out the window at the sea of motorcycles. 300 brothers rode here today because of that promise. And there are 300 more who would have come if we'd asked. The door of the diner opened and a young biker rushed in. Hammer, the Bentley is moving. He's getting out of the car. The room fell silent. Lucas instinctively moved closer to his mother, his small hand gripping hers. Hammer rose to his feet, his expression unreadable. Stay here, he said to Sarah. Let me handle this first. If he's ready to do the right thing, I'll bring him in. If not, he cracked his knuckles. We'll have a longer conversation. Richard Thornton had never felt small in his entire life. He had stood in boardrooms with world leaders, negotiated deals worth billions, and commanded respect from everyone he encountered. But as he stepped out of his Bentley and faced the wall of motorcycles, the crowd of onlookers and the news cameras capturing every moment, he felt something unfamiliar crawling up his spine. Fear. Not of physical violence, though the men before him certainly looked capable of it. What terrified him was the realization that his money meant nothing here. These people didn't want his wealth, his connections, or his power. They wanted something he had spent his entire life refusing to give: accountability. Hammer approached him, stopping about 5 feet away. The other bikers formed a loose semicircle behind their president, their faces hard and watchful. The crowd had fallen silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. You ready to make this right? Hammer asked. Thornton's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to threaten, to find some way to regain control of the situation. But Peterson's words echoed in his mind. The cameras were rolling. The story was already spreading. If he didn't end this now, on these terms, it would follow him for the rest of his life. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. Let's get this over with. Hammer studied him for a long moment. Not good enough. I need to know you understand what you're apologizing for. This isn't about saving face or making a deal. This is about a 9-year-old boy who did nothing wrong and got torn apart by a grown man who should have known better. I lost my temper. It happens. It happens? Hammer took a step closer, his voice dropping dangerously. You called that boy garbage. You said his mother was a disgrace. You said things in Japanese that I won't repeat because there are children present, and you did it because you thought no one would understand. Because you thought you could get away with it. Thornton's face reddened. How do you even know? There was a veteran in that diner. A man who spent 18 months in a POW camp learning Japanese from a fellow prisoner. He understood every word. Hammer paused. And now we all do. The crowd murmured. The news cameras zoomed in. Thornton could feel his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. That boy's father was my brother, Hammer continued. He died serving this country, and his son has been working since he was 8 years old to help his mother fight cancer. That kid has more courage, more dignity, and more worth than you will ever have. And you're going to walk into that diner, look him in the eye and tell him you're sorry. Really sorry, not because we're making you, but because it's the right thing to do. Something shifted in Thornton's expression. Maybe it was the mention of James's military service. Maybe it was the image of a child working to help his sick mother. Or maybe, somewhere deep in the cold fortress of his heart, a crack had finally appeared. Take me to him, Thornton said quietly. Hammer nodded once and turned toward the diner. The crowd parted as they walked, 300 bikers forming an honor guard for an apology 4 years in the making. The bell above the diner door chimed as Hammer pushed it open. The room fell absolutely silent as Richard Thornton stepped inside, his expensive suit wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled, his face carrying an expression no one had ever seen on him before: humility. Lucas was still sitting in the booth with his mother, surrounded by bikers who had become his uncles for the day. He looked up as the man who had screamed at him approached, and instinctively shrank back against Sarah's side. Hammer held up a hand, stopping Thornton about 6 feet from the booth. Lucas, this man has something he wants to say to you. You don't have to respond if you don't want to. You don't have to forgive him. You just have to listen, and then he's going to leave, and you'll never have to see him again. Okay?" Lucas nodded slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Thornton's face. The billionaire stood there for a long moment, seemingly at a loss for words. He had given speeches to thousands, negotiated with the most powerful people on earth, but standing before this small boy in a faded t-shirt, he found himself struggling to speak. He cleared his throat and started again. "I owe you an apology. What I said to you earlier, in English and in Japanese, was wrong. Completely wrong. You didn't deserve any of it." He took a shaky breath. "I was angry about something that had nothing to do with you. A business deal that fell through this morning. Millions of dollars lost because of someone else's mistake. And when you spilled that coffee, which didn't even touch me, I took all of that anger and I put it on you. A child who was just trying to help his mother." Thornton's voice cracked slightly. "I've spent my entire life believing that money made me better than other people, that I could say whatever I wanted, do whatever I wanted, and there would be no consequences because I could always buy my way out. But I was wrong. The things I said to you, they were cruel and they were lies. You're not worthless. You're not garbage. You're a brave young man doing something most adults couldn't do, and I'm sorry, truly sorry." The room remained silent. Lucas looked at his mother, then at Hammer, then back at Thornton. When he spoke, his voice was small but steady. "My daddy always said that being rich doesn't make you a good person. Being kind does." He paused. "I forgive you, but I hope you'll be nicer to people from now on, because words can really hurt." Thornton nodded, something glistening in his eyes that might have been tears. "You're right. Your father was a wise man." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook, but Hammer stopped him with a look. "We don't want your money. It's not for you." Thornton turned to Sarah. "I understand you're fighting cancer, and that you've been paying for treatment while trying to keep this diner running and raise your son alone. Please, let me help. Not because I'm trying to buy forgiveness, but because it's the least I can do." Sarah hesitated, her pride warring with her desperation. But then she looked at Lucas, at the circles under his eyes from working too many hours, at the worry he carried on his small shoulders, and she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thornton wrote a check and placed it on the table. Sarah glanced at the number and her hand flew to her mouth. It was enough to cover her treatment, pay off the diner's debts, and put Lucas through college. "One more thing," Thornton said, turning to Hammer. "I'd like to make a donation to whatever charity your club supports, in honor of James Chen, and in memory of a lesson I should have learned a long time ago." Hammer studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "We support veterans' families, widows and children of soldiers who gave everything. Sarah and Lucas are part of that family." Thornton shook his hand. "Then that's where it will go." He turned and walked out of the diner, past the crowd of onlookers, past the news cameras and into his waiting Bentley. The wall of motorcycles parted, and the black car disappeared down Highway 58 toward Las Vegas. But the story didn't end there. The video of the apology went viral within hours. Millions watched as a billionaire humbled himself before a 9-year-old boy, and millions more learned about Lucas Chen, the son of a fallen Marine who worked at his mother's diner to help pay for her cancer treatment. Donations poured in from across the country. The Hells Angels received more positive press than they had in decades, and May's Diner became a landmark, visited by travelers who wanted to eat where courage had triumphed over cruelty. Lucas never forgot that day. He never forgot the 300 motorcycles that came to defend his honor, or the man who had hurt him and then found the strength to apologize. Years later, when he graduated from medical school, the first doctor in his family, he gave a speech about the lessons he had learned at May's Diner. "My father taught me that real strength isn't about power or money," Lucas said, looking out at the crowd of graduates. "It's about standing up for what's right even when it's hard. It's about protecting the people who can't protect themselves, and it's about having the courage to admit when you're wrong and try to make it right." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. 300 men rode into my town to teach me that lesson, and one man, who had spent his whole life being cruel, found enough courage to apologize to a scared little boy. Both of those things changed my life. Both of those things made me who I am today." In the audience, an elderly man in a leather vest wiped his eyes. Hammer had kept his promise. James Chen's son had grown into a man his father would have been proud of. And somewhere out there, watching the ceremony on his phone, Richard Thornton smiled. The best investment he had ever made wasn't in stocks or real estate. It was in a little diner in Barstow, where he had finally learned that the truest wealth was measured not in dollars, but in dignity.